this is Bari Weiss, who until recently was an opinion writer for the New York Times. However, she has since resigned, and that's because, in her opinion, the New York Times has become a hostile work environment, at least for her. Now, I normally wouldn't create a video about someone retiring from the New York Times, but this is the second time in less than a month that someone who is somewhat high profile in the New York Times has decided to resign. So I felt like it was worth talking about. Let's look at why she's resigning and then see why it's indicative of what's going on in the mainstream media right now. She cited hostile culture and a lack of ideological diversity. And she says, showing up as a centrist at an American newspaper should not require bravery. Now here, I do want to point out that Weiss is not a conservative by any stretch. She is, as she says here, a centrist, or at least left-leaning, but just not as left-leaning as the rest of the New York Times, which is why there have been some incidents. In her resignation article, she says that several employees at the New York Times have bullied her and called her a Nazi and a racist. My work and my character are openly demeaned on company-wide Slack channels. Some co-workers insist I need to be rooted out of this company if it is to truly be an inclusive one, while others post axe emojis next to my name. Some of these employees publicly smear me as a liar and a bigot on Twitter with no fear that harassing me will be met with an appropriate action. They never are. So here we have a list of grievances she says that she's had to endure at the New York Times, which is obviously not something you should have to have at a workplace. Now, I'm fully aware that it's possible she's making some of these up or maybe embellishing. And yes, that's a possibility. But if what she's saying is true, and employees are repeatedly attacking her and bullying her, and the company has done nothing, that is a hostile work environment. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the absurdity of at least one of these claims, where they say that she needs to be out of the company if it's to truly be an inclusive one. And that is that to be really inclusive, you have to be exclusive. And this isn't the first time that she's had this particular argument made against her. Back when she was first hired by the New York Times, The Intercept wrote this article talking about why it's a mistake, and that hiring her for the New York Times embodied their lack of viewpoint diversity, which is really stupid. Again, you can only be inclusive if you include the right people. If they're wrong, and generally if they're on the right at all, they have to be excluded. And it reminds me of this scene from The Office, where you have Diversity Day, and Michael is trying to go out of his way to be welcoming to everyone, except for Toby. It's a welcoming place unless you're Toby. We all know how that feels. And apparently, Bari Weiss is like Toby to the New York Times. As I said at the beginning, this was not the first resignation that's happened recently at the New York Times. Less than a month ago, James Bennet also resigned from the New York Times, and he was the opinion editor. This all started when Tom Cotton, a senator from Arkansas, wrote this opinion piece, Send in the Troops, where he was arguing that amidst all of these riots and this destruction, if the police are not doing what they need to do and they're not able to, then we should supplement the police with the military. This piece has been taken out of context and they've essentially said all sorts of nonsense about it. So let's just look at a few pieces very briefly. So here we have the exact text of the article, and he says, those excuses are built on a revolting moral equivalence of rioters and looters to peaceful, law-abiding protesters. A majority who seek to protest peacefully shouldn't be confused with a band of miscreants. And he says a little bit later, it's past time to support local law enforcement with federal authority. So he is not saying the military was going to come in, crack down on protesters, and take over the place. That's not what was happening. That's not what the media got from this at all. The New York Times wrote this piece, which is apparently not an op-ed, and they said that he was calling for a military response to protests. It highlights that Charlie Warzel, who is an opinion writer at the New York Times, publicly tweeted, I disagree with every word in that Tom Cotton op-ed, and it does not reflect my values. And you know what my response to that is? Of course it doesn't reflect your values. Not everything that the New York Times is going to publish will reflect your values. Because it's not your organization, you're not the one who controls what is written. It's an op-ed piece. Get over it. But the New York Times employees did not. As a matter of fact, they claimed that sources had told them that they would no longer provide them with information because of this op-ed. So apparently, people who were sources to writers at the New York Times were so upset by this op-ed, they're no longer talking to them. But it gets even worse. In response to this, dozens of employees at the New York Times tweeted things like this. Running this puts Black New York staff in danger. How exactly an opinion piece by a current U.S. senator puts a Black staffer at the New York Times in danger is beyond me, but apparently it does because dozens of them tweeted the exact same thing. Now keep in mind, they're saying that running this op-ed was extremely dangerous, and as a result, the opinion editor at the New York Times had to resign because of all the blowback he received. However, 7 years ago, they ran an op-ed by none other than Vladimir Putin. And just this year, they ran one by the Taliban. So are you telling me that somehow these articles from Putin and the Taliban are less dangerous than an article written by a sitting US senator? And in response to this, we're going full circle, Bari Weiss said there was an internal civil war going on at the New York Times between the woke staffers who are mostly younger and the more liberal staffers who are a little bit older. And this is evident in the fact that we've now had 2 resignations in about a month at the New York Times. And in my opinion, it's not just the New York Times that is seeing this, it's a lot of different media organizations. You can see that people who are graduating, getting out of college, and going to these organizations, they are carrying with them the same beliefs that they were taught in college, a lot of it dealing with cancel culture, and if I'm offended by something, that means that you have done something wrong inherently. And that's not how the world works. You being offended does not give you moral superiority over someone else. So Tom Cotton suggesting that we should stop these riots by sending in the military does not mean that staffers at the New York Times are now in danger, because that makes no sense. But if they were offended, then of course the op-ed should not have been published in the first place. So the way I see it, the more people are pushed out of their jobs like Bari Weiss, the more these mainstream media outlets like the New York Times are going to go increasingly left-wing. Obviously, they weren't unbiased already, but now I think it's fairly obvious they're going to be more biased and more focused on what the wokes want and not what the actual facts are. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.